So in the state of Maryland, I have to tell you that you are being recorded if you should speak. And if you, I can take these off now. And the good thing is it will be recorded and put up on our website so people can use it for their class. So, and there are, all the other ones are there except one or two where we had some, I forgot to do the record button. All right, so Haylie, first of all, welcome to IMDRC. Haylie, you want to put up our slides?
Sure. 1 second, let me
Share screen. We use Google Slides. This is very interesting. There we go. So I just want to attribute the title of this, not only to the three of us, but I was on a webinar about 3 weeks ago on AI and ChatGPT. So I put into ChatGPT, giving a seminar on reviewing scientific journals, give me a title, and it gave us about 10 titles, and we decided the good, the bad, and the ugly was really probably the best of the versions. But we have to make our attribution our scientific citation to this.
That's true.
I'm now working on my holiday card coming out of ChatGPT, but it's not quite getting it right. But it is an interesting event. So Haylie, if you could put up the first slide there. Okay, so again, this is the International Motor Development Research Consortium's Journal Club, which is generally on the third Thursday of each month. We focus our article, we invite authors to present their articles that are focused on motor development. If you ever know of anybody and has a current article in 2023, 2023 is now what we're looking at, please let us know. Our organizing committee is David and Haylie and I, and I'll introduce them in a minute. And then also remind you that these are recorded and archived on our website. So today's focus came from my experience and all of the three of us, our experience on how to review articles. And we thought, well, it might be, even if a lot of people didn't come on, that as a resource, it might be very helpful. So what we'll do is we'll present and then we'll have question and answer at the end. Of course, you can tell your stories as well, but in the meantime, you could put any of your comments in the chat box. Okay, next slide. So I would like to introduce my two colleagues in their cute headshots here, David and Haylie. And you can read what it is, but I just want to make a point that both of them have experience as editors and lots of times as reviewers. As the JMLD associate editor for motor development, I've used both of them as reviewers, so I can attest to them being good reviewers as well. And they obviously have done a lot of reviewing in their life, even though Haylie's not quite as old as David and I, and certainly neither of you are as old as I am, but in terms of their experience at doing this. And we had a lot of fun talking about this, and you'll see as we go forward how we're going to do this. So I'm going to make some introductory remarks, and then the two of them are going to take off. So Haylie, if you give me my next slide. So scientific publications, the heart of science is really publishing your work. You know this, whether it's about medicine, that's treatments and things like that, or someone says, well, where's the publication about that? Where is this published? And of course, at the heart of scientific publishing is this idea of peer review, okay? And that's a key concept here. Okay, Haylie. So this is the 7 common types of peer reviews. Most of our journals are double blind, meaning you don't know who wrote it and they don't know who reviewed it. There are a number of journals out there in the world who will use an open peer review system, or third parties and so on, or post review, so on. But by and large, ours are double blind, although some of the reviewers will sign off on their reviews, even though they're not required to do that. And the reviewers never know who the authors are, even though they always try to guess. Next slide. So the process is, first, the author submits their article to the journal. This is just for our grad students who haven't really gone through this process. The journal editor screens the paper. There is possibility in some of the journals in the field, not so much our own, do immediate desk reject. That is, they look to see whether or not it meets a threshold for whether it's the right journal, which is obvious if you're sending off to the wrong journal, they'll, send it back to you saying you haven't, or they'll reject it. Like some of them, like Nature, some of the higher scientific journals will take a look at it and say it's not significant or critical contribution to the literature. So they reject it there. It's not so frequently done in our field, but it does happen. Then it's sent out to reviewers, and we'll hear stories about how many reviewers it takes to get a paper reviewed. And then those reviewers send back their reviews. The editor looks at their reviews. Usually the editor reads it themselves, or should read it themselves, and then they would give their comments and send the reviews back to the authors for making revisions. It could be rejected by the reviewers, or it could be accepted. It's rarely accepted without revision. So for those of you who are grad students, you should realize that the first time you send a paper in, you don't just get an A and it goes off and gets published, but generally somebody thinks they have something that they could add to make your paper better. So you should take it on as, oh, this would make my paper better. Okay, next one. Okay, so the reviewers, who are they? Well, they should be peers. And by that, we mean they are experts in the area of the paper. So oftentimes a journal will ask you to suggest reviewers. Sometimes editors will use those. Sometimes you just think, well, maybe they're just too good of friends kind of thing. But whatever reason. But also you look in Web of Science, Scopus, or Google Scholar to find people who publish in the area. I also look at the citations in the article that's submitted to see who they're citing, to see whether or not they're people that would be an appropriate peer. Again, a peer reviewer, somebody that knows the work that's about to be reviewed. So why should you accept an invitation to review? And I know that a number of you have gotten my invitations. Well, first of all, it's a service to the community. And, if you grow up, as I did, knowing that you're supposed to tithe your time, that is about 10% of your time should be done in service. And the universities where we work mostly want us to give to do service. But also, we submit our own papers and we want somebody to review them. So it's sort of, okay, if you want other people to review your papers, so you should be reviewing them as well. But the other thing is, and I don't want to lose track of this, many times when you're sent a paper to review, you take a look at the abstract, you go, whoa, I'm going to review this. I'm going to find out what these people are doing. Particularly if the editor has sent it to the right kind of reviewer, then you're probably doing work in this area. And so, as we say, it's hot off the press. You'd be one of the first readers of this paper outside of the lab that created it. So you would be able to get a sense of what's going on. So it also can be a plus for you as well. Okay, back to you, David.
All right, thank you, Jane. So this next section is really about the mechanics of the review process. And we've written it all out fairly clearly and concisely, I think. So I'll go through it fairly quickly and just make some comments where it's appropriate. So the very first thing, obviously, is to read the manuscript thoroughly. But actually, before we get to reading the manuscript thoroughly, there are a couple of strategies that you might want to consider adopting. So for me personally, I like to skim the article first, the entire article, just to get a sense of what it's about before I actually dive into it and read it more carefully. And I found that if an article is written well, you can typically just read the first sentence from every paragraph to get a really good sense of what the paper is about. I think that, by the way, that's a great writing tip as well. When you're editing your own writing, if you can go through your paper and get a really good, clear sense of what your paper's about by reading that first sentence, you've written a good paper. So I like to do it that way, and I would call that the outside-in strategy. But other people like to adopt an inside-out strategy. So, for example, another approach is to start with the method section. Read the method section clearly, and then read the rest of the paper after the method section. And a lot of people do that because if the method section is not good, if there's clearly a fatal flaw in the research design or some part of the methodology, then you probably don't have to go much further with the manuscript. You're likely going to come to a judgment based on the methodology. But obviously, if it's sound, then you're going to go through the rest of the manuscript. So you're going to read the manuscript thoroughly. One question you ask yourself, is the topic appropriate for the journal? That shouldn't be a big issue for most reviewers, simply because if the editor and the section editor or associate editors have done their job, they should have already determined that. But it's worth doing it anyway. Next, you're going to evaluate the title in the abstract. You'll be surprised at how often the title misrepresents the content of the manuscript. So it's worth taking a close look at that. Abstracts too, I find one of the most challenging things young writers find is actually writing concisely. And so many times the abstracts are really not good representations of the manuscript, the content of the manuscript. So look at that carefully. Often there's too much information in the abstract that doesn't need to be there, or there's not enough. Finding the right balance is a real challenge. The introduction obviously is the place where the author makes the rationale for their study. So when you're looking at the introduction, that's what you're evaluating. Does the author or do the authors provide an appropriate rationale for this study? And when you get to the introduction, obviously there should be a clearly specified research question or hypothesis. Look for that, because sometimes you'll get to the end and you'll see a very vague statement like, the intent was to explore this particular thing, or examine this particular thing. Now, exploratory studies are fine, but there's always some question that authors are trying to answer. So look for the clarity of that question. And then with respect to literature, obviously the literature that gets cited is going to be used to justify the need for the study. Look to see whether authors have omitted important citations or misrepresented certain findings. And sometimes you'll see that authors just don't cite appropriately. So they'll make a statement, they'll cite a paper that's not really relevant to the statement they're making. And that gives you a pretty good sense that the authors maybe don't have a good grasp of the entire literature. So look carefully for that. Methodology. Obviously, this is a big one. As I said, many people like to start with the inside out and start with the methodology. We all know about the replication crisis in science. It's particularly problematic in the behavioral sciences. And part of the reasons we have this replication crisis is because of questionable methodology that people use in their studies. So look at this section carefully. Look at the rigor of the study design and the methods. Look also to see, and the authors should specify this, whether they pre-registered their protocol. And if they did pre-register their protocol, you obviously need to get that protocol and look at it and determine whether they actually followed the protocol that was pre-registered or whether they actually modified it. And that's a really important thing to point out in the review, if they did follow it or they didn't. Sample size, obviously a big one. We've heard this a lot, particularly in the motor behavior area. A lot of our studies are underpowered and our statistics are overworked. So look for a justification of the sample size. That's important. And then really the authors must have put enough detail in there that anybody else who wants to replicate their study can replicate it based on the information that's there. So check that carefully too. Haylie, if I can get the next one. Results then, obviously you're going to look at whether the results support the study objectives. Look to see whether statistical analyses are appropriate. And here you're going to really look for things like p-hacking. Have the authors overworked their statistics? Again, this is one of the big contributors to this replication crisis I was just mentioning, overworking the statistics. So that's a really important thing to look for. And then figures and tables. It amazes me how poorly people address this particular issue sometimes. Sometimes there are just way too many figures in there or way too many tables, and sometimes there aren't enough. Again, finding that balance is is a really tricky craft. So, look at that carefully. So the discussion, one of the biggest problems I find when I read a discussion section is people think the discussion is just a summary of the findings. And of course it's not. The discussion section is really an interpretation of the findings. So a good summary, a concise summary at the beginning of the discussion is really helpful. But the rest of the discussion really should be an interpretation of the findings. So clearly look for that. The discussion should be grounded in literature, and somewhere in the discussion, the authors need to specify how what they found extends previous knowledge in the area. Because ultimately, you're going to make your decision about whether to recommend acceptance or rejection based on whether this paper makes a contribution or not to the literature. And then finally, also check for the study limitations, because it's really important that a reader knows what those limitations are when they look at the conclusions to see whether the conclusions are really valid or not. So the conclusion, like the abstract, should align with what's actually in the content of the manuscript. So look to see whether that alignment is there or not. Again, like the abstract, look for clarity, look for conciseness. That's important. Check the references, obviously, to see they're up to date. And Haylie, if you can do the next one. Evaluate the writing style. Here, you don't need to be super specific. If the entire manuscript is written poorly, all you need to do is make a comment that the language needs to be improved if there's going to be an opportunity for revision. But you don't need to go in and try to modify every sentence to make it sound better than it originally does. Now, having said that, you will come across some manuscripts that are well written, but you'll see certain sentences that you think could be written much more clearly, and you can obviously then make suggestions when you write your review about how somebody could reword something so that it comes across more clearly than it actually does at the moment. Ethical considerations, you shouldn't have to think too much about plagiarism, because most journals now use software that will determine the extent to which the paper might have been plagiarized. So either the associate editors or the editors would have picked that up ahead of time. Data fabrication, not quite clear exactly how you're going to determine that as a reviewer, but something to consider. And then conflicts of interest is obviously something you can comment on. If somebody has conducted a study on a product and they've been funded by industry, for example, to do the study, they obviously need to specify that as a potential conflict of interest. And if they haven't, that's obviously something you want to bring up in your review. So when it comes to writing your actual review, you want it to be constructive. Ultimately, this is designed to help the authors. It's designed to help the journal to maintain its quality control. It's helpful to organize your comments around major and minor concerns. It's important, again, to be constructive in there. Focus on what needs to be improved. Don't just think that your role as a reviewer is to tear the manuscript apart. We can do that. That's easy to do to a manuscript, but you really want to be balanced here. And ultimately, for the associate editors and editors to make a decision, they're going to be weighing the strengths of the manuscript against its weaknesses. So make sure you highlight both the strengths and the weaknesses, and do so as constructively as you can. Finally, obviously, you're going to make a recommendation here about whether to accept, revise, or reject the manuscript. But there are a couple more things you want to consider as well. So, Haylie, if we can get the next slide. Here, you're going to basically write your review with your comments and your recommendations. Make sure you've kept your review confidential. Haylie in a few moments is actually going to talk about some of the things that happen behind the scenes. And sometimes you don't need to keep the manuscript entirely confidential if you have received permission from the editor or associate editor to actually review it with somebody else, with a student, for example. I'll leave that there because Haylie will say more about that. And then finally, try to adhere to the timelines that the journal gives you and the associate editor gives you. There's nothing worse, and I'm sure everybody's had this experience, to have a paper that's in review for months and months and months, and you hear nothing at all, and you actually have to then follow up with the journal to figure out what's going on with your paper. That happens a lot, probably far more than you understand if you're not on the other side of the journal publishing process. So try to adhere to those timelines. And again, Haylie's going to mention to you that if you need more time, it's easy to ask for it, and associate editors and editors are happy to grant it to you. So then the final thing, remember, a good review is thorough, constructive, and helps the authors improve the quality of their work. It also helps assist the editors in making their decisions. And then ultimately, it's basically assisting the entire field in maintaining its quality and its integrity. So back to, this question of why participate in the review process, because we want our science to be good. We want people to believe in our science, and people are going to believe in our science if we have a really good quality peer review system. So with that, Haylie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
One of the things that David and Jane and I were talking about as we sort of went through what we wanted to share today is that oftentimes when you are newer in this system, either as a graduate student or a postdoc or an early career investigator, or just somebody who's been on the reviewer side but never on an editor's side of the equation yet, sometimes there are some hidden curriculum or bits of people's ways of doing things that you might not know about because we learned from our mentors, and maybe that's not the way it was done in the labs that you trained in. But it's good for us to talk about these things sort of on a broader scale so that there is a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding and a shared culture of how things like peer review work. So one of the things that I mentioned that was always a challenge for me was figuring out the mechanics of this system. What do all of these people do? When I get an email that's signed by an associate editor, a deputy editor, an action editor, what does that mean? What is that person's role relative to the other folks on the editorial board, the other folks on the journal team that are taking a look at these papers? And so editorial board members are generally those that are on call for review in specific content areas, might be a little less active, but can be called upon to review. Typically, the reviews that you get back as an author are going to come from the editor or from a deputy or associate editor. But as Jane and David had both mentioned, it's really important for those folks to not just be a pass-through. And this is something that I, as a relatively new deputy editor, I'm learning that it takes a lot of curation of reviews. It takes going through and helping the authors to interpret what the reviewers are saying or where the common features are among reviews. And so that piece is important, but it's also really important for deputy and associate editors and editors to know the scope of the journal, to know the scope of the paper, and to be able to find that goodness of fit and find the things that really are a good content fit for the journal audience, because each journal has a very sort of specific readership that it's pointed at. And I think this was a little bit different back when journals were in paper and we were receiving printed copies or going to the library and getting printed copies, because you might only be exposed to the things in the 3 or 4 societies that you were actively engaged in, and you might have to seek out the other material. Now that everything's online, I think journals are still attempting to have a focus, attempting to have a specific target audience, but that can get a little bit out of scope. There's some gray areas in the boundaries between journals, especially when it comes to interdisciplinary work. So part of an editor's role is to really make sure they know who is reading the work in this space, and how do we make sure that the most interesting, most relevant things get to them. And then the other role that I think is really important on the editorial side is to adjudicate conflicting reviews. I know as an author, it's super, super frustrating when you get a review where reviewer 1 loved everything in this section and reviewer 2 doesn't think that section should be in the paper at all. And if the editor is silent on that issue, then you're left sort of wondering, what am I supposed to do here? Should I try to appease them both by cutting it in half? Do I take it out and try to defend my choice? And so it can be helpful sometimes then to go back to the editor and say, our read is that these two are asking for different things. Do you have a preference, or do you have a sense of how you'd like us to proceed? Jane mentioned that desk rejections are sort of different from journal to journal, and I have found this to be the case as well. And I think the busier a journal is, the more likely maybe that you will just receive desk rejections for a higher proportion of papers, because if they're receiving hundreds and thousands of papers, they can't possibly send all of them out for review, and they really have to be sort of selective about which ones they are devoting that additional time and attention to. And so some of the common reasons that things might be desk rejected are content fit. Maybe they feel like, this is a more clinically tuned paper, but it's a more mechanistic or foundational science type of journal. Maybe it is just a story that they think their readers have already heard a million times and aren't going to be that compelled by. Maybe there's some clarity issues with the way that the paper is structured, or issues with the rigor of the science. So those are some of the things that might cause a desk reject. If it does get selected for peer review, then the reviewer's selection process is a combination of things. And as Jane mentioned, we love it when authors suggest reviewers for us, because it does sort of put us a little bit down the path of who might be relevant in this work. But we often can't only use their author's suggested reviewers. We've got to go outside of that list and be thinking about, who else do we know who's working in these areas, and where can we find related literature, whether it's in the citations of the paper itself or through Web of Science or Scopus or Google Scholar. And if you haven't seen the editorial portal of a journal before, one of the things that we've talked about is, I think for all 3 of us, for the journals that we edit for, there are ways to search by keyword. There are ways to search by related work. There's a sort of AI fueled way that it will just suggest to you people that are doing similar work. And so that's a good starting point for us if we're not really sure who would be a good reviewer for this particular paper. We also talked about, among the 3 of us, sort of how many people you have to invite in order to get 2 or 3 high quality reviews. Right now, I am inviting between 10 and 15 to get 3. And for Autism and Adulthood, which is the journal that I am a deputy editor for, we have to have 1 autistic reviewer in addition to 2 scientific peer reviewers. And so your autistic reviewer might also be a scientific peer, or they might be a community member, but that sort of adds an extra layer of complication to the reviewer identification, selection, and coercion process of getting people to sort of buy into this process and be part of the work. David shared, I think, that he had on occasion had to invite up to 25, David, I think was your rough number, in order to get 2 or 3. So really, this is something that I didn't realize on the author side until I was on the opposite end, trying to get people to agree to this process, that, at that point, you're making really serious choices about finding people who have complementary but non-overlapping content expertise. And then you as the editor are having to sort of cobble that together to make a whole, or you're having to write really personal invitations, which I know Jane has mentioned is the way that has worked for her over the years, to say, hey, Haylie, what are you doing next week? I really need a reviewer for this. Can you help out for JMLD? So it varies how we find the folks that we ask, but it does help to have the option of people that you suggest. So when you are choosing to accept or decline a review, one of the things that we wanted to hear from you is, when you decline, why do you decline? And we'll have some discussion about this at the end, but if you don't mind just putting your thoughts in the chat right now, if you have been invited to decline a review, a paper, and you've decided, I can't do that right now, if you can share with us some of the reasons that you've decided not to review, that would be really helpful as fuel for our discussion toward the end of this. Some of the reasons that are common that people might decline are conflicts of interest. You might say, well, this is somebody in my sort of mentorship lineage, and I really feel like I can't review this objectively. Or this is the person who sits next door to me in my department and we collaborate, and so I've had too much involvement in this project. those types of conflicts of interest can make it challenging. But another reason that we hear that people decline is they might say, well, I don't have expertise in this one part of the paper. I've got these 2 content areas, but I'm not comfortable with the statistical techniques that are used. Or I've got this content area and I understand the statistics, but I'm missing this population expertise. That's okay. And I think Jane and David and I all 3 feel really strongly that that's still someone we'd be interested in having review the paper, provided that they just share with us where they feel like the gap is so that we can go and find someone who can fill that knowledge gap. So we really want to encourage people to not decline just because you feel like part of the paper is outside of your wheelhouse, because typically we are inviting people with complementary expertise. I might find someone with autism in adulthood who has autism experience, but in children and motor development, and someone who has experience in adults and fall risk. And it's because it's a paper on autistic adult fall risk. And so I'm trying to kind of find those bits that go together. We hope that you will accept reviews for a number of reasons. First of all, Jane's discussion about, how it's just part of our field and we want good work out there. And as David mentioned, this is how we ensure the quality of our fields and ensure the continued rigor of our science as a group. But also it's a great way to get to know the editor. It's a good way for the editor to get to know you and to sort of see the type of work that's published in that journal, see the quality of other reviews, hone your skills as a reviewer by seeing other people's reviews, and sort of building your skill set and your relationship with that community for that particular content area. If you do have to decline, please say why. Sometimes what happens is someone will decline and not say a word, and then I don't know if it's because you felt like it was out of your wheelhouse, and I might go back to you and say, no, it's okay, I've got somebody for that part. Or if you're declining because maybe you're out for the next 3 weeks and you don't think you can get it back to me by the deadline, and I might say, that's okay, I'd rather just have it a little bit later. So if you do have to decline, it's helpful if you can tell us why. The other thing is, as I think Jane and David both mentioned, it's okay to have a trainee support you in the review process. And in fact, we think mentored reviewing is a really important step in the training pipeline. We like to see mentors teaching their mentees, whether they're at the graduate or postdoctoral level, helping people to learn how to do this constructively and collegially. And so if you yourself don't have time to do it, but you can support somebody else in doing the work, just reach out to the editor and say, hey, I'd like to include my student so-and-so or my postdoc so-and-so on this review, and they're going to be contributing, and that's just fine with us. If you do agree to review, we also really hope that you'll make your best effort to review the revision. Just like we prefer if we're submitting grants, when reviewer 1 and reviewer 1 are the same in both study section meetings, because then we're not dealing with separate sets of critique. It's the same for a manuscript. It's really helpful if we can have the same reviewers on a revision because they're already familiar with the paper, and the authors are typically then trying to address their critiques pretty directly, which can make it frustrating if the reviewers are constantly changing. It can feel like it's a moving target. So we also talked about some reviewer archetypes that we have experienced either in our editorial roles or in our roles as authors. And I'm sure you all can come up with some archetypes that are not represented here. And if you do, I'd love to see them in the chat. The first one is the one who's just clearly the author's best friend. It's somebody that you didn't realize had a close personal relationship with the author, but they say nothing negative, everything's positive. Best paper I've ever read, except no changes, right? That person is a friend to the author in some sense, but also not helping to improve the clarity of their writing, the rigor of the work, the fitness for the journal, and ultimately the impact of the work, because it's not going to be as compelling of a paper as it would be if somebody had really done a more rigorous read through of it. So we want to make sure that we either conflict ourselves out from review if we don't feel like we can write objectively, or do our very best to give as objective a review as possible. The next one is someone who gets distracted by a minor point, maybe losing the forest for the moss on the tree. I get fixated on this one part of this one paragraph, and my entire review is really just an indictment of this one idea that you tried to put forward. And I've missed that was just a small part of this larger piece of the puzzle. That can be really frustrating for authors, because then they get the review back and it feels like you missed the bigger picture, you missed what we were really trying to put across. Similar, but a little bit different from that is the person who just skimmed it. They only saw the forest from a very zoomed out view, and they'll ask for things as though they don't exist in the paper. And the authors say, well, we did that in paragraph 4, page 2. We did that on line 73. So we want to make sure that if we're doing a peer review, that we really are not just skimming it, but that we're really reading carefully. As a reviewer, I like to go back through my review after I've done it and see if I can answer my own questions. So I'll go back and say, did I just miss this somewhere? Was it something that initially caught my eye, but now that I'm at the end of the paper, I realize that information was there, it just wasn't where I expected it to be, in which case my comment might be, I looked for this earlier in the paper, so maybe mention it up there. So we want to make sure that we're not doing just sort of cursory review. The fourth is a person who's very offended you didn't do the science their way. There are lots of different ways to do the work that we do. And it's very, very easy for us to get caught up in our own theoretical perspective and get caught up in our own methodology and really feel strongly that that's the best way to do it. We invest a lot of time and energy in trying to answer questions in what we think is the best way. But it's also really important that we be able to take someone else's perspective and not expect them to use our method that we came up with, or our assessment that we've published, or our prior science that we put out there as a proposed unifying framework. Similar to that, down here in our left corner, we have the ideologue who's married to a theory. There can be competing but complementary theories in our field, and it's super important that we not sort of expect everyone to stick to our one way of going. I think we've all been the victim of a self-promoter at some point in our authorship journey, where you could really tell that one of the reviewers was just angry you didn't cite their work. So we want to make sure that we're not pushing that too hard. If your work is relevant, that's perfectly fine to say there's maybe some missed literature in this area. I might suggest a few papers including, just make sure they're not all yours. The person who just says reject, this paper is terrible, is also not all that helpful for us, because then the authors don't really know where to make changes, how to improve things, how to make things better. So reviews that are extremely brief, extremely concise, a little bit chippy, are maybe not as helpful as they could be. And then the final is the copy editor or the grammar slammer, the one who's coming through and really nitpicking every comma, every semicolon, every spelling error. We have people for that at later stages in the publication process. And so we really prefer to see as editors that reviews are focused on content more than they are focused on nitpicky little things like that. I'll say personally, one of my least favorite things to see in a review is when someone suggests that somebody needs a quote unquote native English speaker to have read their paper. I see this in reviews as an editor. I have gotten this comment as an author who was born and raised speaking English because something was grammatically different than someone expected it to be. And so I really encourage folks to not do that. It's not helpful. Some of the other things that we thought you maybe want to know is that it is totally fine to request an extension. I told you that we're out here inviting 10, 15, 25 people to get 3. So if it's going to take you a week longer to return your review, I would far rather give you that week than to go in search of another person to replace you. So as a reviewer, please, try to do things on time when you can, but honestly, we are all super busy. We know what the limitations on folks' time are, and it's not a problem to request an extension from an editor. Similarly, as an author, if you think you need a little more time to make your paper better, if you say, we ran a few extra participants to shore up this piece of analysis that the reviewers asked for, and we need a little bit to get it done, that's worth having a conversation with the editor about, and I think most of us are typically willing to entertain those things. You might also want to talk to editors about concerns about misconduct. As David said, hopefully this doesn't come up terribly often. Major comments to the editor you can make in a couple of different ways. You can send an email straight to whoever the editor is if you know them, but there's also a little box in the peer review portal that says anonymous comments to editor or confidential comments to the editor. We do read those. The reviewers may not see them, the authors may never see them, but the editors take a look at that and use that information to adjudicate or to make decisions or to consult other folks on the editorial team as we need to. So please feel free to use that box. The other thing that folks may not know is that on the back end, as a reviewer, we're giving gold stars and red flags to people based on their timeliness, the quality of their review, how responsive they are, how often they accept or decline. And so you as a reviewer have a history that we can see. And in the Portal for Autism in Adulthood and in many of the Manuscript Central journals, you get a score that's based on the editor's judgment of your timeliness and the quality of your review and the relevance to the manuscript. And so at the end of the day, we're trying to go back to those reviewers who have high quality reviews and who are accepting reviews from the journal frequently. And those folks are often invited to editorial roles. Those are the folks that we might later invite to be an associate or deputy editor because they've shown a commitment to this field and an ability to really engage rigorously in the peer review process. And then David and Jane have both mentioned, I think, anonymous versus signed reviews. There are some pros and cons here. I think, you know, it's maybe a privilege of your career stage and confidence to sign your reviews. It is certainly not a requirement. It's a thing that can be sort of fraught if you end up in conflict with that author down the line, if they feel like you've attacked them in your review. But it also is a way that people sometimes try to signal that they really stand behind their comments and that they're not trying to just undercut you, but that they really are willing to have a dialogue about the work. So I think there are some pros and cons to consider. When you're thinking about the best home for your paper, there are a couple of ways to do that. So you might be thinking first about impact factor or rank, but we'd encourage you to think about what that really means and to maybe focus a little more on audience. Who needs to see this work? Who needs to read this and who needs to be able to incorporate this into their research process or their clinical practice or their policy? And where's the best way to reach those folks? We want to think about reader expertise and interests. I often encourage trainees in my lab to go look at what was recently published with some of our keywords in a given journal and see, is this type of work represented there? And does it look like they're publishing everything around what we're doing, but we're a gap, in which case maybe we're a good fit? Or does it look like they publish everything over here and we're way over here? So maybe that's not the right fit for us and it's more likely to get a desk reject. So we do a little bit of that digging first. You want to look at who's publishing similar work and then the average turnaround time. And we wanted the three of us to caution you that the time of year that you submit your paper can really sometimes affect the turnaround time, because if you're submitting your paper going into the start of a new semester, going into the summer, going into winter breaks, it may be harder for us to find folks who are willing to accept that review responsibility. And so it may take a little bit longer for the turnaround. So really think about that. One of the things I also wanted to see if you had some thoughts on for the chat is, when do you cut your losses and find another journal? Sometimes you get reviews that you don't agree with. Sometimes you're on the third round of revisions for a particular paper, or you feel like there's just a philosophical difference you're not going to be able to overcome. And so I'm curious to know, what are some of the reasons that you've decided to just pull a paper and find another journal, or stop pursuing journals in this particular area and switch to a different space? And then if you're rejected, we really encourage you to look at the suggested alternatives from the publisher and make sure that you're repackaging and rewriting for the new audience. It's very unlikely that the exact paper you submitted to JMLD is going to be the exact paper that's a good fit at Human Movement Science. You're going to have to do a little bit of tweaking to the story that you tell in that manuscript to make it a great fit. When you get your reviews back, it's very uncommon to be accepted without revision, as Jane mentioned. And we all three really believed that the best way to write is to rewrite, and that we can't take these reviews personally. It's difficult. You have to sit with them sometimes. But to really read between the lines, read the editor's comments, and try to get some clarification from folks who are on the editorial team if you need to, or from senior mentors if you can, to try to help you interpret that information. And then again, ask for an extension if you need it. We would rather give you a little bit of extra time and get back a higher quality revision. So with that, I will stop and let Jane plug the conference really quick, and then we can go back to some discussion about what other hurdles you've encountered in peer review, either as a reviewer or as an author, and then we can talk a little bit about what you have in the chat.
Right, and I'll send out a link to where you can pick this up so you can use it again. I want to thank Haylie and David for their comments. Great summary. as a person who has not had to have 25 requests for a review, I do want to make a point that it is important to be a reviewer. Let's just take it out of share screen for now and take a look at the chat box. So I'm looking at why do you not review? Time again is always the question. Sometimes expertise. I'm interested in Elena's comment that expertise, hopefully if we're doing a good job as an editor, we've picked you for the right reason, but telling us that you're not the right person is good also. But when you do that, tell us, this is my area of expertise, so that the editor now knows better where to put. I have a spreadsheet of my reviewers, and underneath each one is what I think their expertise is. So if I've picked you for the wrong reason, that would be good. So to know. So Elena,
This was
have
not
you had
going
that
to you, by
sometimes
the
happen?
way.
Yes, does that
This
happen
was
to
not
you?
going to you. I'm just talking about other journals where they asked me to evaluate certain aspects which I didn't feel confident I had the expertise to evaluate. This is why I mentioned that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
But I think, can I just butt in? I think you can also, you might feel expertise about some of the paper, but not all of it. So you can always do what you feel confident with and then put in the comments back to the editor, I wasn't confident with this statistical approach, or I don't know much about this, but I've commented on everything else. And then at least the editor knows they've got a review on something, and the other reviewer might pick up what you couldn't do anyway.
That's a great point, Lisa, because lots of times people are using very fancy statistical models, and you would say, I can't do this. Look, I don't do logistics, something or another. And that, just say that to the editor, and the editor will run off and get another reviewer. And many journals have a sort of a set of people who will do these methodological issues. So what was the other one I saw? Oh, I don't think that it's not valuable. I think that's a good point, Lisa, because if you think it's almost like a desk reject, if you think that when you read the paper or the review or the abstract, which is what's sent to you, if you think it's not a significant contribution to the literature because it just is something that's already been done, then say that back to the editor when you say no, because then they might take a relook at it. Because they've asked you or someone else for their expertise, and they take one look at the paragraph of what it is, which is how you get to know whether it's an article you want to review. And you go, no, this is not, we've already done this 1,000 times. We don't need another one of those papers. So other comments?
I think Lisa also had a comment about having the same rejected paper come to you as a reviewer through another journal. And I think that's a really good point, that, we have to, as authors, be thinking about that possibility and realizing that, you may not know where it's going to go or who it's going to go to, but you have to take those comments on board and at least consider addressing them before you submit somewhere else, because the likelihood is, if this editor thought that Lisa was an expert, the next editor is going to think Lisa's an expert as well and send the paper to the same person, at least on first pass.
Yeah, it's happened to me a few times, and it's really annoying when they haven't tried to change anything. So
Right.
it's kind of like, I mean, not that they have to do everything that you want, but I think it is always good to go through and go, well, I was rejected. What may I want to change, or perhaps I need to rethink some of it, or make a slight attempt not to submit the same thing somewhere else, because it doesn't put the reviewer in a very good mood.
No, I've had that same thing happen to me too. And it is annoying because you spend all this time sort of telling them the things they should consider, and all they've done is just send it back out just as it was. And it's like, do you not think it might get the same reviewers? So heads up to all you young graduate students, don't do that again. Okay, other comments, questions?
Yeah, Ellie, go for it.
Okay, I have a question. So I'm still writing some papers, and I'm always struggling, and I know I can ask you guys because you have a lot of experience. I'm always struggling with finding the right title for the paper.
try ChatGPT.
No.
No, I'm only kidding, because as I started, if you didn't come on at the beginning, that's how we got the title for this this seminar. Really, the trick, I guess, with ChatGPT is doing the right prompts.
Okay, okay.
But you're right. The title, oftentimes the titles don't relate at all to the paper. And
Mhm.
that's a shame. But they also should be, I don't want to say clever, but they should grab my attention, because when I go through all the emails that I get saying, here's the new papers out, or when I'm looking at a journal, I want something that like tells me, one is what it's about, but also one of my friends said the titles, this is a guy in exercise physiology, the title should tell you the results.
Really? Or just
That's what
trigger
exercise,
you?
that's what an exercise physiologist would say,
Yeah.
you know.
Or should it just trigger you? It doesn't tell everything, but just enough to, I don't know.
What do
But-
other people think?
Do you
Yeah,
agree
I
with
think you
that
can
though?
look at it both ways, Jane. I particularly like titles that will tell you the results, because, you know, you can, there's so much literature out there that we need to read and cover. It's really helpful to know whether it's worth picking up the paper and reading it. And if you can get that from the title, great. But also, Ellie, what you were sort of implying, I think it's not a bad idea to use the title as a lure as well, to get people to read the paper. So put enough information in the title where you're not necessarily giving away all the results, but you're giving away enough where somebody's going to say, oh yeah, I definitely need to read that paper to get the rest of what's going on. But I
Some
don't think we
journals
pay
have-
nearly as much attention as we should to the titles of our papers. I mean, how many papers titles start with the effect of such and such on something else? I mean, I would say probably 75% of the papers out there,
And it doesn't tell you what
read
the
that
effect
way.
is. It just
And,
says the effect of, it doesn't tell you what the effect is. Lisa,
Mhm.
you were going to say something.
Some journals have guidelines for putting study design in the title, for instance, so blah, 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 a cross-sectional study or a randomized controlled trial. Or so I think you can, sometimes you have to follow those guidelines. And I don't think there's any rule. It could be the results. It could be trying to get somebody's interest. It's good if it stands out a bit and it doesn't sound like every other title, because then if people are trying to remember your paper and it sounds like many other papers, that's difficult. I think it's good if it's not too jargony personally, but I mean, I think there's no real rule here.
I think
As
your
long as it
point is a good
reflects the
one about-
paper.
I think your point is a good one about journal guidelines, because there are also journal guidelines about whether your title can be a declarative statement or whether it has to be sort of a question or a vague thing, or yeah, so following those is definitely important. My millennial might be showing here, but I think I maybe take a slightly different strategy, which is to think about search engine optimization when I'm writing a title for a paper, because 9 times out of 10, people are going to be Googling looking for papers on a particular topic as they're trying to understand a background of an area. And so I'm thinking about, what are the words that I want Google to find? What are the words that I want Scopus to find that maybe aren't as represented by mesh terms? Because often mesh terms are sort of broader than what we do specifically. But how can I get words in there that are going to pop up for the right people who are looking for this work? And can I do that in a way that doesn't make a too jargony, jumbled up sounding statement?
That's a great idea. I think you're right. There's also an AI engine called, I think it's called Explicit or Implicit, where you put in a PDF of something and it finds all the PDFs that look the same. And that's, I went to this webinar on AI tricks, but that was one of them. I think it was called Implicit. And really, you literally uploaded a PDF of something and it came back with all the PDFs of all the ones that were like it. It's like, who needs to go to the library? But I think the point of a search engine terms is a very good one. In fact, they always ask you to do keywords. And I'll tell you, the keywords are like motor development, like duh, you know.
I have beef with JMLD for that reason, Jane. There are not enough keywords that represent the areas that we work in.
I'll
Not
let
enough
them know
mesh
that, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard when you're having to select keywords from a particular menu. So that's often why I'll cram them into the title, because they may not exist in the journal's menu of keywords that I could flag with.
I'm
or
pretty
in the
sure
meta-
Twitter was not one of the keywords you could.
No, Twitter was not one of the keywords. I don't even think social media was an available keyword, which is sort of a broader umbrella term. So
That's interesting.
yeah, thinking
Yeah.
about what might not be searchable from those standardized terms, and can you get those into the title somewhere?
Yeah, I'll make a
Again,
point to
without
tell
too
them
much
about
jargon
that.
or nonsense.
David, you mentioned something, I wrote myself a note about pre-registration protocol. Do you want to explain what that is to those who might have just thought that was some kind of jargon expression?
Yeah, so registered reports are becoming increasingly common, where, I mean, it's a type of paper in its own right, where somebody would submit their protocol for peer review, and they can actually get the protocol published before they actually conduct the study and then write it up and eventually get it published. So the whole idea is to promote open science, to make the whole scientific process more open and transparent. So if somebody's pre-registered their protocol, then regardless of their findings, whether they get null findings or clear findings, they've got an opportunity to publish their paper. But at the same time, if the pre-registered report is out there and it can be compared to the final paper that's submitted for publication or published, you can see whether they map onto each other or whether the authors deviated from what they published previously as a pre-registered report. So I've had instances as an editor where reviewers have pointed out, hey, the authors have pre-registered this study protocol, but they deviated this and this and this, and they need to address that in the paper. I mean, there are some legitimate reasons for deviating from what's been published, but obviously you need to declare what those reasons are and then let the reviewers determine whether the reasons are appropriate or not.
That's great. One of the things JMLD doesn't do, but a lot of journals do, is also let you upload your data to a website or further analyses that aren't in your paper too. I haven't talked about that so much. I don't know if either of you have experience with that or anyone does.
Yeah, we keep a GitHub repository from my lab that has code that was used to analyze data and the data sets themselves. And we keep those in some of the pieces we keep in a private GitHub, just archived so that we have what went with that paper in case anybody asks for it. Some things we keep in a public GitHub so that people could go, and we would reference that in supplementary materials so that they could go and look at it later. The Twitter papers are an example of that, where we have the code that we use to extract that data as supplementary material for the papers. And I think that's useful sometimes on a reviewer end and on an editorial end, both, because then it gives you some sense that the information is out there for fact checking if you felt like you needed to verify whatever you were seeing in the paper.
Right.
At our department, we use Open Science Framework a lot.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Of course, only the data that were important for the paper, not the full data. But like with our reference value paper, everything is on Open Science Framework.
yeah. Well, and also there's more and more repositories of the videos as well, for those of us who are in the movement science, you know, to be able to see the babies walking or something like that, which is also Karen Adolph runs a whole NSF supported Dropbox kind of thing, putting those things.
Databrary is the resource.
Oh, the question is, how important is the cover letter? I have to say that I never look at the cover letter. I should.
Yeah.
David, do you?
No, I don't look at it too carefully. No, I don't. So I look at it, but I don't look at it carefully. So personally, I
think that
don't.
somebody
think
looks at it
it's-
to be sure that you say it's never been published someplace else. So there's administrators behind our work that look at what it says. And one of the things you have to usually write is this, all of the, it's the ethics. Everyone has reviewed the paper before it was submitted, and 2, that it has not been published anyplace else. And I assume that's been looked at by somebody else.
I think it's personal preference of the editor. So I think some people do look at cover letters and some people don't. And but to me, I feel like it's another way to pitch my paper in a quick few sentences,
Mhm.
something that doesn't, it's not just repeating the abstract. It's something that if the editor's very busy and they're not going to read the whole thing, which they often don't read the whole thing, they're just looking at snapshots to just, that it might be something where I can pitch the importance of it quickly that they can look at. So I feel like it's still worthwhile to do, even if some people don't do it. Some editors don't look at it.
Yeah, I definitely would support your point. That's an important thing to do. But I think the journals all require that it state those two things, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I look for in cover letters sometimes too is why this journal. Often authors will say, like, we think this will be of particular interest to your readership because, and so sometimes that helps me to go, oh, that's why you put it here. And maybe I'll help them sell that point more effectively in the comments that I send to them. I might say, like, I agree with you, our readership would be excited about this, but it doesn't really come out as strongly as it could. So maybe rework a little bit. So sometimes knowing what the author's mindset is about why they chose that journal can be helpful.
Right. Anybody else for
Thank you.
questions? I don't want to run us over time. I know it's first thing in the morning for Lisa, but the rest of us, especially those in Europe, are going, okay, it's bedtime. So I want to remind you that this will all be, I will stop recording in a minute and it will be uploaded in a few days on the IMDRC website. It will also have a password that's in there. I also want to remind you that January 18th is our next journal club, and we'll be back to our format of having it be a journal that's being brought to you by one of the authors or the authors of the journal article. And I would again encourage any of you to submit articles that you think we should take a look at. They should be presented one of the authors should be at least a member of IMDRC. If they're not, we can always encourage them to become members of the IMDRC, which we have done in the past, where I've contacted people who I thought should have been or didn't know about it and convince them to do it. Lisa.
Oh, just one thing before we go. There's lots of free training for reviewers, like Web of Science training. So I usually get my students to do those trainings and assist them in parts of it where they have to do a review, and then I can do a review with them, etc. So I think if lack of expertise is one of the reasons, you could do those Web of Science trainings or any of the other trainings out there. And you could also ask a more senior person at your university going, I want to review this, I'm not quite confident, can we do it together? And then asking the editor, like was suggested. So I think definitely reach out, because I do try and do that with the people in my group. And I'm sure the senior members of your groups out there would also do that with you.
Yeah, it's sort of mandatory in all of our groups, I think, to do that in their training. And again, it helps them to understand all the things that when you submit a paper, that it's going to get critiqued, and also how to do it in a professional way that is going to be helpful to the authors. But I didn't know about the Web of Science. Do you have that link that for that? You could send it to me by email and I'll put it in the.
And one other plug, just following on from the issue of people
Just put it in the
not feeling
chat,
they have the
sorry.
expertise or the time to do the review. It's so helpful if, as a reviewer, you decline the review if you can suggest alternative reviewers. I know some people feel like they're throwing their colleagues under the bus when they do that, but it's incredibly helpful to have alternative suggestions if you can't do it.
Yeah, I think the alternative suggestions are great. It's just the sheer volume of requests, but we can't go into that now.
Well, I think that's always going to be the case when you're a senior person with an expertise that a lot of people are writing about at the time. So whatever it might be is the sort of thing of the month, or I mean, finding people, when Haylie submitted her papers on Twitter, finding people who'd done an analysis of Twitter was a challenge. And people were going like, I don't know what I could do with this, it's like, and they'd write back and say that, which is fine. But so when you're doing something that's avant-garde, or you're doing something that is the vogue topic all of a sudden you're going to have the same kinds of people, whatever the journal, it might be just our journals or somebody else's journal. David's asking you and I'm asking you, and so from another journal is asking you always to review. So if you're good, that's what they're going to do to you. So yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
In our department, there is a bit like a rule of thumb. If you are submitting like this year 3 papers, then you should at least review 3 papers.
I like your department.
Not everybody is doing it like that, but maybe that's something, I mean, we should communicate more about with like the juniors.
That's a good
I've
rule
never-
of thumb. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never thought about it. We now we just have a new crew that started on the toddler project. And I'm like thinking, yes, this is a bit overwhelming, a lot of work with them. I really love it, but reviewing is now the thing that I don't, well, I have the feeling that I do not have the time for that, but I could start doing it with them as it is suggested over here. And I think I have always reviewed the amount of papers that I have submitted to journals. But I think that it's a completely different story for me when compared to the seniors over here. The amount of papers you guys submit every year or the ones you co-author are probably extremely high. So maybe that is not a good rule of thumb. I'm not sure about it.
Well, I think there's 2 sides to that, because if I send out a paper, I want somebody who's competent to review.
Of
And
course.
so that's going to be someone maybe who's higher in the field than a young assistant professor. Although I'll tell you, young assistant professors are the ones that are most eager to review because they want to be known by the editors. And they also want to understand the process more. That the more senior you get, and I'm looking at it when I was a department chair and I looked at the vitas that were submitted each semester or each year at the end of the year about what people have done. The senior faculty didn't review anywhere as many papers as did the young faculty. And a part of that is they just wanted to be known out there, and they also wanted to read those papers. So the other reason is you're reading things hot off the press, kind of thing. So it's a struggle really to find the balance.
The other thing that I don't think has been mentioned just before we go as well is that there used to be Publons that kept a record of all your reviews, and now I think that's changed to the Web of Science. So I use that, which is just like a deal breaker. So if you have to produce something for promotion or anything, it gives you every review that you've done, the journals, like all your editorial stuff, it's all there on a website. And all you need to do is after you've reviewed is just send it to that email address and it just tallies it all for you. That's all you do. So
I think that's done automatically within
it's done automatically within some journals, but if it's not done within a journal, you can do it yourself independently.
Okay.
And I actually did it retrospectively when Publon started, because I had kept like a record of my reviews and I sent off like years of reviews and it updated it all for me. It was like amazing.
That's
So
nice.
yeah, but I think it's now done with Web of Science. They took it over, but
Yeah.
I can see
Because it
Haylie
says there,
nodding.
do you want this to be counted? Because there's a place in the box on there when as you submit your review. But I think the
Yeah.
idea of, 1 for 1, I'd actually say 2 for 1, but oh, because you had to have 3 reviewers for your paper, right? But I do think it's a sort of something that is part of the ethos of being a scholar, is that part of what you do is you do service. You serve on committees like Lisa and Matu. You serve as officers of journal or of societies, and so you act as editors. You just need to give that back to the science because you want other people to do this for you as you're kind of coming up. But I think 3 for 3, I think it should be 3 for 6, 6 for 3. Well, you have to have 3 reviewers on each one, right?
Correct.
Actually, this is being done in some ACM and IEEE conferences where we submit, I mean, it's not journal papers, it's conference papers, which may be 6 or 8 pages that are peer-reviewed. And when you submit, you actually get then an invitation to review right away. So this is being done in some conferences. Maybe this can be done also in some journals. Maybe they can
Nice.
kindly request that.
Yeah. Well, it's a challenge, and David is the one who said it took it 25 asks to get his 3 reviewers. That has not happened to me, but I'm hoping it doesn't. 25 is a lot of people to ask. I'm not sure I know 25
That's definitely happened to me. I think it probably happens less with a journal like JMLD because it's
very
quite
narrow.
focused on a topic area. But once you're an editor for a more general journal like BMC Public Health or something like that, and you get a whole range of topics, and some are quite specific, and it's quite difficult to find somebody, and just the sheer burden of people. In fact, that's why I'm not an editor anymore, I have to say, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Lisa, your comment about the value of the paper figuring into your decision whether to accept to review a paper or not is huge, because you know a lot of papers will come across my desk. I'll read them and think, this is publishable, but it's not going to make a great splash in the literature. But I don't really feel like I can just reject it, and so I'll send it out to review. But then I know people are looking at it and saying the same sort of thing. It's like, yeah, this paper's okay, but it's not going to be a great contribution, so I'll just decline it. Those are the ones that I find require the most requests to get people to finally agree to review them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been hopefully helpful. And I want to thank Haylie and David for jumping in to do this. It's been fun working with them. We had a good time discussing. I really like the archetypes of reviewers. We had a good time discussing those people.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, particularly the ones who want to change every little word that you have in your, the that's and the whiches and the, and then there's still the controversy about the data were or the data was. I just read a paper today. It's like on the chalkboard with me. It has to be data were, but then I don't say media were. So, I mean, really, let's be serious. That it should be media were, not media was. Social media is the same pluralization. So
that's the beauty of English, all the inconsistencies.
So for over your Christmas break, if you have not read I've just lost it for a moment, The Mother Tongue, it's a fabulous book about English. I'm trying to think of the guy who's written a lot of books. He's written The Walk in Appalachia. Oh, anyhow, I give it to all my foreign students to read because it shows you the beauty of English. So give you the example, PDF means what? Portable document format, right? It is now a verb. I PDF'd it. The French would never let you do that without any offense to the French, but there are some languages you cannot just make up a word, but English, you just make up the word and say, I PDF'd it. How do you microwave your food, or do you mic it, or you nuke it? What can I say? The Mother Tongue. And it'll come to me in a minute what his name is, but okay, that's it. Happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Great presentation.
Thank you. Yes. Wonderful. Stop.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
And if Haylie and David would stay on for just a moment.
Bye. Thank you.